So now it's 12:30.
Good morning. There are basically three systems I'm going to talk about. We as humans take raw materials from nature, we process them, and in the process there's a lot of economics and sociology and politics and philosophy that goes on, and then we dump our waste back into the environment. The first two, that is taking natural resources from nature and dumping onto the environment, are essentially environmental problems. The middle, that's the processing of what we take from nature, is a whole lot of things mixed up, and we cannot divorce one from the other. They're completely connected, and therefore I'm going to talk about all three of them, and basically arrive at the conclusion that today we are at a turning point, and it can be described in two ways. Either we can choose to keep our climate and change the economy if we want to become a sustainable society. And sustainable development, I will not go into it very deeply unless you want to later, is an oxymoron. You can either have development or you can have sustainability. You cannot have both of them. So you have to choose between, we have to choose between them. The other is, we can say, all right, let's have development, let's have the economy grow and things of this sort, and we can say, to hell with the climate. And whatever the consequences be 100 years down, we will see. Anyway, we won't see. Our grandchildren will probably see the consequences of that. And that is why, towards the end, I'm going to pose a simple question. Either we say that we continue along the current gain maximization for a few, which is the outlook that human society has had ever since permanent agriculture came into being almost 5,000 years back, or we have to shift gears completely from there and start looking at what nature does, which is risk minimization for all. And I'm going to amplify on this a little bit towards the end. Okay. Now, I'm going to start with climate change and then expand the discussion a little later into all kinds of other things, into politics and history and so on and so forth. So we've had two meetings very recently on climate change. The first happened in Copenhagen, and that basically provided us with the synthesis report of the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. So I won't get into the details. And what they were saying was very, very clear. These two meetings actually, the outcomes contrasted each other. The first was very clear. The scientific meeting said that essentially climate change, what is happening is unequivocal. There is no doubt about it anymore. And that unless we agree that we have only 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide left to emit, leave aside the units and dimensions, that's not important. So what the meeting said is that we can dump only another 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and if we exceed that, we are very likely to see a temperature rise of over 2 degrees, which is going to be highly dangerous to both the environment and to human society. Now, the other meeting happened in Lima last month, or rather in December, and that meeting was a whole lot of muddled meeting with mixed signals, the outcome being very poor, and essentially it's a run-up to the Paris meeting at the end of this year, which is supposed to come up with a successor agreement to the Kyoto Protocol. And this meeting, basically, let me just very quickly tell you what the meeting said. What the outcome of the meeting was, is that each country is left to now declare what it is willing to do in terms of climate change, and that then, if at all any agreement is arrived at in Paris by the end of the year, will be the thing that will happen next. Now, why do I say that the outcome is likely to be dim? What we have done over the last almost 250 years, ever since the Industrial Revolution began, was that we've used up close on 35% of the total fossil fuel reserve that we had, which is 1700 gigatons. And in doing that, we have emitted 2000 gigatons of carbon dioxide. That's already created a bit of a havoc because it has raised temperatures by almost 1 degree since 1750. And what we have left now is we can dump only another 1000. That is half of what we have dumped since 1750 is what we can dump between now and, if we want to remain within 2 degrees Celsius, which all scientists more or less tell us is what we can afford to do. Beyond that, there will be all kinds of feed-forward mechanisms that may come into play. Beyond that, we are not able to say very clearly what might happen. In case the Greenland ice sheet starts melting and so on and so forth. Okay, this is what IPCC is saying very, very clearly. There's no doubt about it. So what have we done? We've already gone up by 0.85 degrees or almost 1 degree Celsius. That has already raised the sea levels by nearly 20 centimeters. It has shrunk the summer ice in the Arctic region by 40%. Now the glaciers are shrinking by a massive amount right now, and it has caused all kinds of problems like poleward migration of species, which has been recorded elsewhere. For example, in India, apples no longer grow at the altitudes that they used to earlier in Himachal. They grow at higher altitudes because it's warmed up, and so on and so forth. I won't get into the details. All this is available on the net, and those of you who are interested can see it. So I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to get into really what is happening. And are we in a position to stem, this huge juggernaut that's building up? Now, in Lima, on the other hand, where the countries, the nearly 200 countries that met, tried to negotiate, tried to arrive at an understanding of what needs to be done, essentially there was no agreement except to say, all right, by the middle of this year, each country is going to declare what it is going to do, whatever it be. Okay. Now, what is the precursor to this? The Kyoto Protocol is a massive, not just a failure, but a fraud, actually. If we start looking at the numbers, it's a huge fraud that's happened. And it's strange that people have not really looked into the numbers and written about it, but we are hoping that that's going to start happening soon. Kyoto Protocol was brought into effect in 1997. 42 developed countries were, got into a binding agreement that together they will decrease their emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, by 5.2%. What actually happened was something different. What actually happened was that they decreased their emissions by 16%. Now, you may say, hurrah, we've done a damn good job. The numbers need to be looked at very carefully. Because when you look at the numbers, essentially what you see is that the non-European emitters, the largest non-European emitters, US, Canada, Japan, and Australia, instead of decreasing by 6%, actually increased by 6%. So they were 12% short of where they were. If you look at Western Europe was supposed to decrease by 8%, they decreased by 7%, they came pretty close to their target. If you look at East European countries, basically the ex-Soviet bloc countries, they decreased by 55% their emissions. Why? Because the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it the Soviet bloc collapsed, and their economies shrank. So between 1990 and 2012, which is the Kyoto Protocol period 1, they shrank by 55%. So essentially what they did was they subsidized the other countries, the other what are called Annex 1 countries, which had a binding commitment to reduce. Canada walked out in 2011 because instead of decreasing, they actually increased enormously because they were digging out, they started digging out their shales and so on and so forth, and things of this sort. US, of course, never ratified the protocol, so the Kyoto Protocol was not binding on the US. Okay. The second more important factor is, why do I call the Kyoto Protocol a fraud? Now, by reducing by 16%, they reduced their carbon dioxide emissions by 32 gigatons of carbon dioxide. But the way that carbon dioxide is computed is what is called territorial. That is, in a territory, how much of carbon dioxide is emitted. So regardless of whether you export or import, it is the territory that matters. Now that is not what actually we should be looking at. What we should be looking at is the consumption. And this is something that people have belatedly started realizing now in the last 2-3 years or so. So when you start computing, what you need to do is look at what is the territorial emission, and then you take the carbon dioxide of the goods and services that are imported, and you add that, and you export the carbon dioxide, you deduct the carbon dioxide of the exports from this territory. That is when you will come to a true understanding of what is the actual emission because of consumption. Now when you do this with the developed countries and developing countries, India and China actually have been exporting a lot, particularly China, of goods and services. So when you start looking at the developed countries and what they did in terms of trade emissions, their trade emissions, which means what they got in through imports from the developing countries, particularly India and China, is 45 gigatons of carbon dioxide over this period, which means that actually whatever they reduced, which is shown on paper, is much less than what they imported from these countries, minus their exports, mind you. These are called trade emissions. So I take out the exports from those countries, add in the imports from the developing countries, and I find that the Kyoto Protocol actually is a huge failure, because the emissions in terms of consumption of the developed countries actually has increased by 40% and not reduced by 16%. So this is the thing. So right now, the Kyoto Protocol is a failure. Now, if it is a failure, then what is it that the Kyoto Protocol really achieved? There are a whole lot of people who have gone up and down to these countries, the negotiators on behalf of the government, the industry lobbyists, the NGOs, and so on. When you start computing what is their carbon emission, you find that their carbon emission is equal to the carbon emission of a country like Tonga. And essentially, if you take this carbon emission, it's going to take a forest like the Nilgiri forest with 5,000 square kilometers of forest available, a full year to sequester all this carbon dioxide. So is it even worth having these negotiations and meetings and so on? Besides creating awareness about global warming, Kyoto Protocol in fact has not achieved very much. Now, let's look at the recent reduction pledges. Pledges have been made by 4 major countries or entities. The 4 entities are the US, China. China is now the biggest emitter, followed by the US, followed by the European Union, which I call an entity, and then India. These are the 4 major emitters. They contribute 60% of the total carbon dioxide or total greenhouse gas emissions. There are several other countries which have also pledged that we will reduce, but those are minor amounts. Now, when you look at all the pledges that these countries have made, and we did the maths ourselves, we find that if you go along the current path of what is happening, that right now carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions are increasing by between 2.5 to 3% per annum. Now, if you go along a business as usual kind of a curve, the remaining 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide will be filled up by 2035. If you take these pledges into account, namely US, China, India, and the European Union, the delay is only 5 years. So by 2040, we would have filled up the 1,000 what is called remaining carbon space. And after that, it's, well, your guess, my guess, where it is going to go. But if you look at what IPCC is saying, that if you go along this pathway, then by 2100, we're going to be between 4 to 5 degrees above, there's going to be a 4 to 5 degree temperature rise above pre-industrial times. Now, what that is going to do to nature, to human society, its economy, etc., is a huge, right now, a guess. Despite all that has been written, we are not sure exactly what is going to happen. So what is it that, for example, the UNEP GAP report is saying that right now we are emitting 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide. What they're saying is that, 37 rather, what they're saying is that by 2020 we need to be at 40, and after that we need to reduce by 2.5% per annum. Now at present growth rates, we're going to be at 44 to 45 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2020. So we are way off the mark. We're way off the mark. We are on the way to getting to 4 to 5 degrees Celsius by 2100. So essentially what IPCC is saying is that the human influence on the climate system is very clear, number one. Number two, the more we disrupt our climate, the risk is going to be severe, and the impact is probably going to be irreversible. This is what they say. Very, very clear. So on the one hand, you have science saying one thing. On the other hand, you have politics, which is saying nothing very much, actually. Let's look at historically what has happened. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution, mind you, just a bit of information. Until about 1500, India's and China's, of course you didn't have an India, but whatever, is this entity called India that we call today India. The GDP of both these countries was right on, for almost 1500 years, right there on top at number 1 and number 2. Just prior to independence, in fact, India's share of manufacture was close on 25%, whereas Britain was only 2%. China was about 30%. At the time India got independence, the share of India's manufacture came down to about 2%, whereas Britain was at about 25%. Now, if you look at emissions, the historic emissions prior to 1750, the energy that we used was basically biomass and animate energy. And with due respect to the chairperson and historians and so on, I would say that the history of both nature and human society is actually the history of energy conversion. Not of some kings and queens, as they say, it's like a timetable, some king came and some queen went. It's not that really. Of course, history has gone, the science of history has gone much further and recognized that the history of technology and history of many other things actually now need to be included. But when I read history in school, there's about some king coming and someone else going and so on and so forth, like on a timetable, like a railway, like some trains going up and down and so on and so forth. Actually, the history is the history of energy conversion, but I won't get into that subject right now. If you look at the historic emissions of greenhouse gases, 75% of the total historic emissions ever since the Industrial Revolution began was done by the developed countries. If you look at the per capita, I compute per capita on today's population, then the per capita historic emissions of developed countries is 4 times that of the developing countries. So even if you take this 1000 gigatons of carbon dioxide, remaining carbon space as it's called, and give it to the developing countries, they can never reach where the West has already reached. The developing countries are in a catch-22 situation. Why? Because if they agree to emission cuts in the Paris meeting in December, then they are saying that we will permanently remain underdeveloped. If they do not agree, then they are at risk, because the most vulnerable populations and most vulnerable geographic regions are in the developing countries. The sub-Saharan region, Southeast Asia, the small island nations, These are the most vulnerable thing. Every time I go to the Maldives as an environmental engineering consultant to the UN, the only thing, I go there to talk about transboundary air pollution, and the only thing that the Ministry of Environment wants to talk to me about is our Mount Everest is 2 meters above the sea level, and in a few decades we're going down. So we're going to become permanent refugees. Let's forget about all this air pollution and talk about, what is going to happen to us in our future. So this is the whole problem. Now, climate change, global warming, is one of the two tipping points that we face, society faces. I'm most scared of the other tipping point, which is peak oil, and I will develop that. And ultimately, climate change is actually a subset of the whole problem of energetics, of how human society has dealt with energy historically. And without again getting into the detail of that, what I'm going to say right now is that we have crossed the boundary of sustainability quite some time back, almost 30 to 40 years back. And we are overdrawing on the natural resources, particularly energy. The minute you talk about energy, actually you talk in a sense about all the other natural resources as well. Because without that energy, there is nothing you can do, actually. No energy, the universe comes to a stop. What is it that has made us overdraw these resources? There are basically two ideologies. The first is, and I've posed this question many times in many places and never got an answer. The first is private property of nature. You privatize nature, and this has been done ever since permanent settlement, since slavery began, and we've got into this trouble. Now, I've never understood how, by putting in 1 joule of energy, I get back between 50 to 80 joules in coal. By putting in 1 joule of energy into oil, I can get back anything from 20 to probably 35, 40 joules. Now, nature baked this for 300 million years, ever since Precambrian time, and made it into what it is, coal, oil, gas. How do I put a fence around it, put in a very small fraction of energy, and then claim it's mine and say if this is called energy return on energy invested? It's like, you put money into a bank and you get back so much. Now, by putting in 1 joule, how do I get 79 joules back and say that is mine? Now, which principle of nature allows you to do that? I can understand cooked up principles in economics or whatever else in law that can do these things. But which principle in nature permits you to do this? Now, if you claim you have a usufruct right, yes, the question comes up as to what is your share versus the rest of nature. But the whole problem is this, that by investing 1 joule, when I get back 50 joules, 80 joules, and I say that the balance, 49 or 79 joules is mine, then this has become a problem. Because the minute I do that, ever since the time of slavery, what has happened is that people have wanted to accumulate more and more of this, what I call surplus energy, or in value terms, profit. Okay, so this is one huge problem. So since slavery, we've seen this right through feudalism up to capitalism. This whole siphoning out of surplus by a few and accumulating it and calling it mine, and therefore excluding a whole lot of others. And as long as you don't break the system, the whole problem of exclusion, in fact, cannot be solved. And today, this whole business of Gini index is computed within a country. But when you start computing the Gini index, which tells you what is the difference in equality or inequity, it's a measure of inequity. When you compute it across nations, then your Gini index turns out to be pretty high. And it's only growing. And very recently, in fact, the IMF managing director said, well, the number of dollar billionaires in India has grown enormously in the last 2 decades. And if just this money could have been spent on alleviating poverty, then the poverty in India could have been eradicated 2 times over, quite some time back. So this is our problem, which one of the speakers highlighted even earlier this evening. Now, I would like to measure things in terms of inequity. When you start looking at inequity, the inequity, at national levels is huge. For example, the per capita inequity between, if you look at the third column from the right, EPS plus biomass, if you look at the inequity out there, India is at 0.6 ton of oil equivalent per annum, whereas the US is close to 7. Inequity is massive between countries, and within a country again it's huge, and there lies the problem. So the second ideology is the ideology of anthropocentrism. Again, an ideology which is probably 5,000 years old, because many religions have sanctified the whole understanding of what is the relation of humans to nature. Essentially saying that nature is meant for humans to enjoy, take whatever you want, whenever you want, from wherever you want, how much ever you want. And that's what we've done. That's exactly what we've done for close on ever since agriculture came into existence. Of course, it's speeded up enormously. Now, the quest of development, in fact, has been the quest for energy. If you look at what the hunter-gatherer did all the way to what we do today, we followed the path of energy. We've gone out of Africa, gone into valleys where energy was the most. Basically, if you look at the energy yields of good agricultural land, it's close on 10,000 kilocalories per square meter per annum. Whereas if you go to a desert, it's 500. You go to the Antarctic, it's probably only 50. So if you look at the whole migration of human beings, it's gone that way. If you look at the way that wars have been fought, it's ultimately a quest for energy. If you look at borders, ultimately it's nothing but saying that, from that hill to this river is, my people will harvest the energy. If you look at modern day borders, it's nothing but saying, India, this border, the Indians will harvest energy from here, and the other nation will harvest energy from there, and so on and so forth. How they do it, how they distribute it, is a different matter. Okay, this quest, ever since fossil fuels other than nuclear energy is the densest form of energy that is there in existence, and we have gone to a point where suddenly in the last 250 years, particularly in the last 50 years, there's a massive spurt in the use of energy and therefore the extraction of raw materials from nature. And that's led us to a whole lot of problems. Environmental problems, and what have you, and so on and so forth. Right at the end, I'm going to make a correlation between knowledge and energy and come into certain other issues out there. But if you look at technologies, now with each jump in technology, you find that the energy draw actually starts jumping as well. As against 2,000 kilocalories that a hunter-gatherer drew per day. Today we have a modern industrial society drawing close on 250,000 kilocalories per day. That's a massive jump in terms of energy, and we're close on 7.125 billion population. So what happens? What happens is that your energy draws per capita just jumps. And if you look at this curve, essentially what it is telling you is that, we have jumped particularly in the last 100 odd years or so. Finally, it is consumption. And it is the consuming parts of the world which really have taken this energy and used it enormously. So, energy return on energy invested I've already talked about. What Stiglitz says, or what many other economists today say, is trickle-down theory. That is, somehow you develop at the top and it will come down to the bottom. It's not worked. It's worked to a certain extent in the last century in the developed countries. It's not working now in the developing countries. So we'll have to discard this whole theory of, trickle-down theory. Green energies just don't have the energy return on energy invested. And that is why